And joining us tonight, Christopher Walken, with 40 years in film, some 90 roles to his credit, and the ability to play anything from the cruelest villain to the most ardent cowbell enthusiast. Thanks for coming on the show, Christopher Walken. Thank you. Some nights in Hollywood are nights that people never forget. 41 of these was November 28, 1981. Christopher Walken was with actress Natalie Wood, her husband Robert Wagner, and the boat's captain, Dennis Davern, on a yacht called the Splendour. What started as a weekend near California's Catalina Island finished with Wood in the cold Pacific Ocean. She was only 43 years old, and for more than 4 decades one question has refused to go away. What happened in those last hours? The next morning Wood was found about a mile away from the yacht. At first her death was ruled an accident. But years later that story changed. Investigators reopened the case, and the circumstances surrounding her death came under new scrutiny. Christopher Walken has never been charged with a crime in connection with Wood's death, and that's important because this story isn't about assigning guilt. It's about knowing what was said, what was asked, and why the mystery has lasted so long. Walken was already a rising star in Hollywood. He had an odd screen presence which directors loved. He could be funny, scary, awkward, or deeply serious, and it wouldn't make much difference at all. But he wasn't playing a character on that boat. He was just Christopher Walken, and, apparently, something had gone wrong between the people on the yacht that night. The precise details have been argued for years. So, if you were hearing lots of different versions of the same night, which one would you believe? Tell me in the comments, because the biggest surprise is the mystery didn't start when Natalie Wood went missing. It started with what happened before anybody realized she was gone. But first, to understand why Walken became forever associated with the story, we have to go back to the man he was before that boat ride, and the strange path that had already made him one of Hollywood's most unforgettable actors. Long before Christopher Walken was linked to one of Hollywood's biggest mysteries, he was just a young boy from Queens, New York, with a dream of performing. He was born in 1943 as Ronald Walken, the child of a working-class family. His father had a bakery, his mother loved movies and pushed her kids to perform. Walken began working in television as a child. Broadway was next, and he slowly made a name for himself. But Walken was never your Hollywood star. He wasn't the sort of leading man audiences were used to. His voice wasn't normal. He was not moving as he had before. The way he paused between words could make a simple sentence sound mysterious. And that was his greatest strength. And then, in 1978, things were different. Walken won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for The Deer Hunter. The unlikely actor from Queens was suddenly one of the most respected actors in Hollywood. But with success came something more. More attention, more famous friends, and an eventual invite that would put him inside a tragedy he could never quite break free from. By 1981, Walken was working with Natalie Wood on the film Brainstorm. Wood was already a major Hollywood star, with such films as West Side Story, Rebel Without a Cause, and Splendour in the Grass to her credit. Walken and Wood were co-stars. They knew one another. By Thanksgiving weekend they were aboard Wood's yacht off Catalina Island. At first it appeared to be a typical Hollywood getaway, but there was an edge already. Wood was married to her former husband, Robert Wagner, whom she had remarried years before. The younger, successful Walken was busy working with Wood on their movie. Then the dinner. Then the drinks. Then an argument. And sometime later, Natalie Wood was gone. That straightforward chain of events would become the focus of decades-long arguments. The first explanation offered was that Wood had simply fallen accidentally into the water in an attempt to secure the yacht's dinghy. But the questions around that explanation never quite disappeared. What was she doing out there alone? Why were the accounts of the night different? And what did happen between the people aboard the Splendour before she disappeared? Those questions were even harder to ignore because Wood wasn't just any actress. She was one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. Her death made national news. And just like that, Christopher Walken's name was forever linked to that night. But surprisingly little more would Walken himself add. And that silence became part of the mystery, because sometimes what a person won't say can be almost as potent as what he does say. And in this case, there was one conversation on that yacht that investigators spent years trying to get their heads around. The night of November 28, 1981, started like a holiday weekend, but by its end, one of Hollywood's biggest stars would be dead. On board the Splendour were Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, and Dennis Davern, the captain of the boat, off California's Catalina Island. They'd been drinking, talking and hanging out while Wood and Walken were working on Brainstorm. Then the tone shifted. Later accounts relate a heated conversation between Wagner and Walken about Wood's career. Allegedly, Wagner thought Walken was pushing Wood to focus more on her acting career, while Wagner wanted to concentrate more on family life. Whatever the words, serious the tension, and then there was the moment that would haunt them all. Wood was not there. At first, the story was treated as a terrible accident. Authorities said she probably went into the water trying to hold onto the dinghy. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning at first. But there was something about the story that never seemed resolved. The dinghy was found near the yacht. Wood was in the water wearing a nightgown, socks, and a jacket. And questions began to arise as to her last hours of life. Walken largely stayed out of the public discussion for years. He was already back to his career. Movies came and went. His reputation increased. But the mention of Natalie Wood's name brought the same night back. Then the case turned decades later. In 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened its investigation into the death of Wood. The cause of death was later changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. That didn't mean authorities had proved Walken, or anyone else, had killed her. But it showed what a lot of questions remained unanswered. And then came another great development. Captain Dennis Davern recanted parts of his earlier statement, saying he believes an argument between Wagner and Wood turned physical. Wagner has denied killing Wood and has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing. Authorities have never publicly accused Walken himself of causing Wood's death. This distinction is important because in the 40 years since the internet was created there have been a lot of theories. Some blame Wagner. Others doubt Walken. Some believe the initial accident theory remains plausible. But theories are not facts. The truth is that no one observing from the outside can know exactly what happened on that boat unless the evidence proves it. And that's what makes the story so haunting. There was no camera to record those final moments, no perfect witness account, just 4 people on a boat, and only 3 of them lived to tell what happened after. And before we tell you what Christopher Walken has really said about that night, remember this. The key details came from statements made years apart, sometimes changing as memories and investigations evolved. So before we judge anyone, we have to look at the evidence, because the next part of the story is where the mystery became much darker, and it would eventually follow Christopher Walken for the rest of his life. For years, the death of Natalie would seem to be a tragic accident. Then the questions could not be put away. In 2011, 30 years later, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case. Detectives said there was new developments. Wood's death certificate was later reclassified from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. That one change brought the old story back to the headlines. And then, people were looking at that boat again. They were watching the timeline. They looked at the statements. They asked why certain details didn't seem to fit together perfectly. The small inflatable dinghy, found away from the Splendour, was one of the big problems. Investigators were trying to determine how it ended up in the water and what she had been doing just before her death. But there was another problem. The people on the boat did not tell exactly the same story. Later, Captain Dennis Davern made statements that contradicted his original statement. He eventually said he believed Wagner had been involved in an argument with Wood shortly before she disappeared. Wagner has denied killing Wood and has never been charged in connection with her death. And where was Walken during all this? He was present. That fact alone kept his name on the story. But presence is not proof of wrongdoing. Walken has never been charged in Wood's death. And there was never a public finding that he killed her. In fact, Walken has largely avoided turning the tragedy into a public spectacle. That might sound odd coming from a guy who spent his life in front of cameras. But perhaps that was the idea. Walken had a career, a family, a private life, and a painful memory he clearly didn't want to revisit in public. But the reporters kept at it. And one of the most important things about Walken's story is not some dramatic confession. It was what he did not. He did not turn the mystery into his career. He did not make a publicity campaign of Wood's death. He went on acting. And his career went almost surreal for how successful it was. Pulp Fiction, Catch Me If You Can, Hairspray, The Dead Zone, Batman Returns. Generation after generation they heard the odd voice, the wide eyes and the unforgettable screen presence. But now and then someone would mention the yacht. And Walken would be pulled back into 1981 yet again. That's when the tale gets bigger than Hollywood's mystery. Because think about being famous for decades, and one bad weekend forever sticks to your name. Lots of people watching this might relate to that feeling in a different way. One moment in your life can be the moment everyone will remember. But one chapter doesn't tell the whole story. Walken's strange truth is that tragedy preceded some of his most famous work. And he didn't disappear afterward. He got more successful, but the shadow remained. Then came the question that made everything even more awkward. What did Christopher Walken really say to investigators about those final hours? Because when you strip off the rumors from the documented record, his story is a lot more subdued and a lot more complex than the headlines would lead you to believe. And there the mystery takes its most significant turn.